Hey everybody, what is going on? So in this section, we're going to talk all about authority, and what that means is understanding the decision-making process at the company you are trying to sell into. Now, the first thing we got to start things off with is that you really need to understand how the other company works internally, especially when you're selling to larger organizations. So if you're selling to, let's say, a small mom and pop shop, they only got like one co-founder or two co-founders and a couple employees, then it's very straightforward and you know who the decision makers are. Usually it's going to be the founders. And if you are selling into a larger company, let's say you're selling into Oracle or Salesforce, or you're selling into Google, how does that work, right? Because it gets very complex in who's the right decision maker, who approves the budget, who has to approve the purchase of whatever it is that they're buying, and then how many levels up does it have to go? So there are going to be all these different questions that come into play when you're selling to larger organizations. Sometimes selling to smaller organizations, let's say you're selling to a company with 20 employees or 50 employees, you still need to figure out who the decision makers are, because sometimes it is the founder, sometimes they may give power to the director or head of whatever. So you really need to know who these people are. Now, the first thing we got to cover when it comes to the decision making process, and this is essentially, who are the authority figures that make the decision at the company, is that let's go ahead and cover the pitfalls first. So the first thing that I'll say with you is that a lot of salespeople and sellers, they don't know who actually has the decision making power at the company. Sometimes you may be talking to a low-level person and they have no decision-making power and it's a complete waste of time. And sometimes you feel like you can get the sale really quick, but then you realize that, wow, there's this crazy internal process and it takes months and months before they can actually close the deal. So these are all things that you need to figure out usually on the first or second call. Now, the second point is that you don't know the prospect's timeline, right? So timing is also going to be very important, because it's not enough just to understand who the authority figures are in the sales cycle, but you need to also know this timeline. When exactly can they actually close the deal? Because you may have all the right people in the room and everybody likes your product or service and they have the money to pay for it, but it's just not the right time to buy it, and that's going to bite you back if you don't figure it out ahead of time. Now, prospects also may be lying to you. It could be intentional or not intentional. What I mean by this is that if let's say you're talking to a low-level person and you ask them like, hey, when do you think you can make the purchasing decision? And they say next week. And you think in your head, oh, wow, that's great, let's close it next week. But then in reality, another week passes and they say, oh, we can't do it. Another week passes, oh, they can't do it. And the reason for why this happens is because you weren't clear on exactly what the decision-making process was like at their company, and that you weren't getting the right authority figures in the room or on the phone. So when I say they're lying to you, I mean that they're not really telling you the full truth, and they're not telling you exactly how the decision-making process works at their company. Sometimes they got to get approval from one person and another person. They got to get budget and blah, blah, blah. So these are the things that you really need to watch out for when it comes to decision-making, because it's not about just pitching your product or service and wowing the other person. You really have to know, like, granularly how the decision is made at their company, because if you don't know these things, you're leaving it to chance. And if you leave it to chance, then obviously you're not going to be a consistent seller. Okay, so now we're going to get into the goals of the decision-making process. So you want to make sure that you do not fall into a situation where the prospect has to think it over. Because, once you finish a sales meeting and the prospect says, hey, let me think it over with my team and blah, blah, blah. And some people might say, okay, think it over and reach back out to me, and then nothing happens, right? That happens to a lot of people. And with more time that passes, that time will actually kill deals. So you don't want people to think it over. You actually want a yes or no, and you don't want any think it over. You don't want any maybes. And if they say no, that's fine. If they say yes, you want to make sure you know every single step it takes to actually close a deal. And the thing is, you also want to make sure you are in communication with all the key decision makers. Now, when I mean decision makers is these are the people that are going to approve the budget, approve the purchase, they're going to sign the check or approve the credit card transaction, whatever it is. You need to make sure you're talking to those people, because you cannot rely on another person trying to sell your products or service to their boss. You want to make sure that you get them in the room, and it doesn't have to be on the first meeting. It could be on the second, the third, the fourth, or later on, but you want to make sure you at least talk to them once to make sure that you know who these authority figures are. Like I said before, figure out the decision-making process for the individual or the company, right? So if it's an individual, make sure that they have to maybe talk it over with their wife or their team, their business partner, whatever. If it's a company, again, make sure you know who needs to approve the purchase. And the thing that you got to keep in mind when it comes to a mindset perspective is you don't want to guess. You don't want to guess how a decision is made at another company. You just want to get to the truth. And sometimes you may feel a little uncomfortable asking these tough questions and getting to the truth, and that's okay, but you need to get it done as an effective seller, because selling, it's not about just being a showman and getting people excited. That's kind of part of it, but the other major part is understanding all these little details on how decisions are made. Because when you think about selling, you're actually helping someone make a buying decision, and if somebody buys, you need to understand how they buy. Now, when you're digging for more information on how the decision-making process works and who are the authority figures and everything like that, you have to take note that you got to ask a lot of questions before getting to the truth. And that's what I'm saying when I say customers and prospects lie intentionally or non-intentionally. That's why you got to keep asking these questions to really understand what's going on. Because if you kind of let it go, and if you say, oh, if they say they'll think it over, that's not good enough. You need to understand, what do they need to think about exactly, right? And what timeline do they need to think about? Who needs to think about that? And so you need to answer these questions if you want to make a successful sales. You probably talked about their pain and budget at this point, and what you want to do now is you want to summarize the pains that you talked about, the critical pains and how much budget they have and all these things, and then you want to get to the authority question. So an example of that could be, so it seems like you have XYZ challenges and have a budget to solve for these challenges. Am I accurate here? They're going to say, yeah, that's pretty accurate. And then you say, so let's say we could help you. What's that going to look like? It's an open-ended question where the other person can respond in any way they can. And typically what happens is prospects will just tell you exactly what needs to happen in order for a deal to close. They may say, okay, so now I got to go back to my team and see what they think. And then I need to talk to this person and make sure we have the budget and things like that. And then you could follow up with whatever they said by saying, okay, do you think it makes sense to schedule another call with that person you just said you need to talk to make sure we're all on the same page? So you can say something like that to schedule the next meeting so everyone's on board. Another example you can use is, if we were to move forward, what would the next steps be, right? So it's same exact philosophy as the first example I gave you. You're basically asking an open-ended question, asking what the next steps are going to be to move the sales cycle forward, and then that person's going to tell you whatever it takes to actually move the deal forward. So I'm going to give you some more questions that you can play around with, and you can figure out which one works best for you. And when you ask one, you can ask another and another and another to make sure you get all your I's dotted and T's crossed, and you know how the decision is going to be made at a company. So some more examples is, will you be the main person we'll be working with, right? They're going to say yes or no. If no, then who else? Is there anyone else we should involve in this process? Who else will be giving us feedback on this project? Is there anyone else who will be affected by this at your company? Typically, when I work with clients like you, there's an approval process. I was curious to know if your company had one as well. So all different examples on how you can figure out what the steps are for the other person to make a buying decision. Sometimes it's really easy where you ask a question and they say, yeah, I'm the decision maker. I own the company. You're talking to the right person. Other times it may be a little harder where they are clearly not the decision maker. Let's say they're a low level person at the company and they say, oh, I can make a decision. And then you say, well, are you sure this won't affect anybody at the company? And then they'll think, oh, well, it's going to affect my boss, obviously. So then you could say, okay, well, what do we need to do to get your boss on the call so that we make sure everyone's on the same page, right? Something like that. And essentially, when you're asking these authority questions, it all comes down to a couple key things. And, it's pretty basic that you learned this in elementary school. It's like who makes the decision, what their roles are, what happens in each decision-making process, when will the decision be made, meaning you need to really understand the timeline. Timeline is very important. What level will the decision be made at? Director, VP, CEO. How will the decision be made? Voting? Will they compare against a competitor? What would that meeting look like? And why? Why are decisions made this way? So you don't necessarily have to have every single one of these things answered, but the more information you know, the better you are in terms of being confident in how the decision-making process happens at another company, and also knowing who all the authority figures are and what needs to happen to close the deal. If you don't know this, again, you're kind of rolling the dice in maybe some things you know, some things you don't know, and then sometimes the deal fall apart because the timing's off, or maybe you're talking to the wrong person, or it's just there's so many things that can go wrong in a deal. So that's why you just need to know. So with that said, that's pretty much everything you need to know when it comes to understanding who the authority figures are in an organization and what needs to happen at that company in order for a deal to close. So you just want to understand it from a mindset perspective, right? There's all these elements like who, what, where, when, why, and how, but you just need to understand every single step that a company takes to make a deal happen. Because if you don't, again, you are rolling the dice. But so with that said, that's everything when it comes to understand the decision-making process and understanding these authority and authority figures and using these questions to really understand how a deal is made. So with that said, that's everything that we got to cover when it comes to authority, and I will see you guys in the next section.